Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are reading Journal Collection number 64, and this is one of the shortest of the journal collections, and obviously it will be done in one video as the last several I think have. This dates from the year 1873, and Emerson is going to be 70 years old in this year. So I will start, of course, with a biographical update from the editor. In spite of rest, friendly faces, and interesting scenes, the old feeling of the unprofitableness of travel for travel's sake, which has appeared so often in Mr. Emerson's writing, would assert itself, especially in the early part of the journey. His daughter records some of the dismally witty remarks that he made on the Delta as they passed through it to Cairo. Could anything argue wilder insanity than leaving a country like ours to see this barrenness of mud? Look, there is some water, and see, there is a crowd of people. They have collected with a purpose of drowning themselves. Although he would have been quite willing to go home, he said that he would gladly spend a fortnight with Mr. Lowell in Paris, and desired to find in England Tennyson, Ruskin, and Browning before his return. Also, before leaving home, when Egypt was suggested, he said, "Yes, I should like to see the tomb of him who sleeps at Phila." At Cairo he was pleased to find Mr. Bancroft, and went about the city with him. Mr. Charles G. Leland and Mr. Augustus Julius Hare were also agreeable. General Charles Stone, formerly of the United States Army, then Chief of Staff of the Turkish force in Egypt, and his family showed great courtesy to Mr. Emerson and his daughter. End note. Shepherd's Hotel, Cairo, January 1873. Nothing has struck me more in the streets here than the erect carriage and walking of the Copts, I suppose them, better and nobler in figure and movement than any passengers in our cities at home. On Tuesday, January 7th, we sailed from Cairo to Philae in the Dahabe Aurora, with Mahmud Badoua, dragoman, and Reyes or captain and his mate. 10 oarsmen, 2 cooks, a factotum boy, a head waiter named Martzuk, and second waiter Hassan, in all 18. The company in the cabin were Mr. and Mrs. Whitwell, Miss May Whitwell, and Miss Bessie Whitwell, Miss Farquhar, a Scotch lady, Ellen, and I. Egypt very poor in trees. We have seen hardly an orange tree. Palms are the chief trees along the banks of the river from Cairo to Assuan, acacias and fig. In Cairo we had a banyan with its boughs planting themselves around it under my window at Shepherd's Hotel. Egypt is the Nile and its shores. The cultivated land is a mere green ribbon on either shore of the river. You can see, as you sail, its quick boundary in rocky mountains or desert sands. Day after day and week after week of unbroken sunshine, and though you may see clouds in the sky, they are merely for ornament and never rain. The prophet says of the Egyptians, "It is their strength to sit still." Papyrus is of more importance to history than cotton. All this journey is a perpetual humiliation, satirizing and whipping our ignorance. The people despise us because we are helpless babies who cannot speak or understand a word they say. The sphinxes scorn dunces. The obelisks, the temple walls defy us with their histories which we cannot spell. Every new object only makes anew questions which each traveler asks of the other, and none of us can answer, and each sinks lower in the opinion of his companion. The people, whether in the boat or out of it, are a perpetual study for the excellence and grace of their forms and motion. No people walk so well, so upright as they are, and strong and flexible, and for studying the nude our artists should come here and not to Paris. Every group of the country people on the shores, as seen from our dahabeah, look like the ancient philosophers going to the school of Athens. In swimming, the Arabs show great strength and speed, all using what at Cambridge we used to call the southern stroke, alternating the right arm and the left. All the boys and all the babes have flies roosting about their eyes, which they do not disturb, nor seem to know their presence. It is rare to find sound eyes among them. Blind beggars appear at every landing, led about by their children. From the time of our arrival at Cairo to our return thither 6 weeks, we have had no rain. Unclouded summer on the Nile to Assuan and back, and have required the awning to be spread over us on the deck from 10 a.m. till late in the afternoon. In Egypt, the sandstone or limestone instructs men how to build, stands in square blocks, and they have only to make a square door for tombs, and the shore is a pair or a series of steps or stairs. The lateen cell is the shadow of a pyramid, and the pyramid is the simplest copy of a mountain or of the form which a pile of sand or earth takes when dropped from a cart. I saw a crocodile in the Nile at a distance. We arrived at Thebes 19th January. Then it says Esna with a question mark 24th, and at Assuan 28th January. Visited Philae on Wednesday 29th January. Arrived in Cairo Thursday 13th of February, making 38 days for our expedition and return. The magnet is the mystery which I would fain have explained to me, though I doubt if there be any teachers. It is the wonder of the child, and not less of the philosopher. Goethe says, "The magnet is a primary phenomenon, which we must only express in order to have it explained. Thereby is it then also a symbol for all besides, for which we used to speak no word or name." See Plutarch Morals, Volume 1, page 156, Old Copy Edition. Tuesday, January 28th. Met Mr. George L. Owen at Assuan, our party and is exchanging visits. I found him a very intelligent and agreeable companion. In the dahabeah in which we found him on the Nile, he shared the cabin with only one companion, Mr. Ralph Elliot. Editor's note. This meeting with Mr. Owen, also a second soon after, in going down the Nile, was a very agreeable episode. Mr. Emerson's health was steadily improving, and with it his enjoyment. At Cairo, Mr. Emerson and his daughter parted from their friendly traveling companions, took ship for Italy. In passing, he enjoyed the sight of Crete and its mountains, birthplace of Zeus, and after landing, hastened on to Rome. They had little time for sightseeing in 11 days, but received constant visits and kind attentions. Mr. Marsh, the American minister, and his wife were very kind, and they saw their friends, the von Hoffmans, also the Storys, the Howitts, Lady Ashburton, Mr. Tilton, the artist, Miss Sarah Clark, and Dr. Wister of Philadelphia. End note. In Florence, I hoped to find Hermann Grimm, who, as I had heard, was residing there to complete his Life of Raphael. Immediately on my arrival, I sent Kernex, the traveling servant, to the German bookstores to inquire his address. Neither of these knew of his presence in the city. In the street I met Mr. Bigelow, our American minister at Paris, and asked him for news of Grimm. He did not know that he was here. On my return to the Hotel du Nord, I found Mr. Bigelow's card, saying that immediately after leaving me he had met Grimm in the street and learned his address, which he had written out for me on his card. And Grimm had also called and left his own. I went at once to Grimm and was received and introduced to Gisela, his wife, and invited them to dine with us that evening, which they did, to the great satisfaction of Ellen and me. He speaks English very well, and Gisela, who does not, talked with Ellen in German. Editor's note. Mr. Emerson had never met Grimm, although he and his wife, daughter of Bettine Brentano von Arnim, had corresponded with him occasionally for years. The meeting was very pleasant and fortunate, as Mr. Emerson and his daughter were to set out for Paris the next morning. In Hermann Grimm's Essays is a very interesting account of how he first became acquainted with Emerson's writings. Grimm's comments to Miss Emerson on her father's appearance are interesting, as showing not only the benefit of the Egyptian voyage, but what a wholesome-looking man he was, even to the time of his last illness, and how much certain pictures belied him. His daughter, writing home from Florence, said, "Hermann now began telling me of his pleasure in beholding father, and said every photograph did him great injustice. They all represent a feeble old man of 70. He looks like a strong man of 50. They look as if he were made of iron, of copper. He looks as if he were made of steel. He has a fine, sharp, manly face, in such bright coloring, which is all lost, of course, in the photographs. End note. March 16th to April. In the Hotel de Lorraine, Rue de Beaune, Paris, where Ellen and I took rooms for some weeks during both our visits to Paris, we lived with James R. Lowell and his wife, and John Holmes to our great satisfaction. There also I received one evening a long and happy visit from Mr. James Cotter Morrison, who is writing the Life of Comte. At the house of Mr. Лагle I was introduced to Ernest Renan, to Henri Taine, to Elie de Beaumont, and to some other noted gentlemen. M. Taine sent me the next day his Littérature Anglaise in 5 volumes. The enjoyment of travel is in the arrival at a new city, as Paris or Florence or Rome, the feeling of free adventure. You have no duties, nobody knows you, nobody has claims. You are like a boy on his first visit to the common on election day. Old civilization offers to you alone this huge city, all its wonders, architecture, gardens, ornaments, galleries, which had never cost you so much as a thought. For the first time for many years you wake master of the bright day and a bright world without a claim on you, only leave to enjoy. This dropping for the first time the doleful bundle of duty creates, day after day, a health as of new youth. In Paris, your mere passport admits you to the vast and costly public galleries on days on which the natives of the city cannot pass the doors. Household cares you have none. You take your dinner, lunch, or supper where and when you will. Cheap cabs wait for you at every corner. Guides at every door, magazines of sumptuous good and attractive fairings, unknown hitherto, solicit your eyes. Your health mends every day. Every word spoken to you is a wonderful and agreeable riddle which it is a pleasure to solve, a pleasure and a pride. Every experience of the day is important, and furnishes conversation to you who were so silent at home. Editor's note. Mr. Emerson now, as witnessed above, was greatly improved in health, and his memory and power of finding the right word in conversation had so far returned towards the normal that he no longer shrank from going into society. He and his daughter arrived in London on Saturday, April 5th, and went to comfortable lodgings. They remained in the city 3 weeks. On their previous stay, London had been comparatively empty of persons whom they would naturally have seen, but now friends and visitors were most attentive, and they had little time for sightseeing, as they had daily invitations to lunches and dinners. Of course, the meeting with his oldest and best friend in England was what was foremost in Mr. Emerson's mind. Of the call on Carlyle, Miss Emerson wrote, "He was in more amiable and cheerful humor than he had been a few days before when father walked with him, and father has been very happy in the remembrance of this call." Just before leaving London, she writes, "Father, after breakfast with Mr. Gladstone, spent the forenoon with Mr. Carlyle with real comfort, bade him good-bye, and then went to the Howards and lunched with Mrs. Lewis." End note. April. In London I saw Ferguson the architect, Browning the poet, John Stuart Mill, Sir Henry Holland, Huxley, Tyndall, Lord Houghton, Mr. Gladstone, Dean Stanley, Lecky, Froude, Thomas Hughes, Leon Playfair, Sir Arthur Helps, the Duke of Argyll, the Duke of Cleveland, the Duke of Bedford, Sir Frederick Pollock, Charles Reade, Mr. Dasent. With the Amberleys I paid a visit to Lord Russell at his house and lunched there. I failed to see Garth Wilkinson, though I called on him twice, and he left his card twice at my door in my absence. William H. Channing was, as always, the kindest of friends. Moncure Conway was incessant in his attentions, and William Ellingham gave us excellent aid. George Howard, who will one day, I hope, be Earl of Carlisle, was the most attentive and generous of friends. Mr. Thomas Hughes introduced me to the Cosmopolitan Club, which meets every Sunday and Wednesday night at 10 o'clock, and there I saw on 2 evenings very agreeable gentlemen, Sir Frederick Pollock, Ferguson, Lord Houghton, William Story, and others. Professor Tyndall procured me the privileges of the Athenaeum, which is still the best of the great London clubs, and also of the Royal Institution in the Albemarle Street, where he presides since the death of Faraday. Visited John Forster at his own house, Palace Gatehouse, Kensington West. Editor's note. From London, Mr. Emerson and his daughter went to Chester for a day or two, the guests of Lord and Lady Amberley, who showed them Tintern Abbey, and thence they went to Cyfartha Castle to visit Mr. and Mrs. Crawshay. End note. At Oxford, April 30th to May 3rd, I was the guest of Professor Max Muller, and was introduced to Jowett, and to Ruskin, and to Mr. Dodgson, author of Alice in Wonderland, and to many of the university dignitaries. Prince Leopold was a student, and came home from Max Muller's lecture to lunch with us, and then invited Ellen and me to go to his house, and there showed us his pictures and his album, and there we drank tea. The next day I heard Ruskin's lecture, and we then went home with Ruskin to his chambers, where he showed us his pictures, and told us his doleful opinions of modern society. A footnote states, with Mr. Ruskin's constant jeremiads on the state of the world, and especially of England, Mr. Emerson was annoyed and displeased to such a point that he roundly rebuked him. End note. In the evening we dined with Vice-Chancellor Little and a large company. Editor's note. On May 3rd, the Emersons left Oxford for Warwick, where after seeing the castle they were met by Mr. E. F. Flower, an old friend who took them to his home at Stratford-upon-Avon, where they spent 10 days. On Sunday, at the door of the church, they were met by the clerk, who led them to seats in the chancel near Shakespeare's tomb. Before sailing for home, they made a short visit to Edinburgh, but no record appears in journal or letters. The presence of Mr. Norton and his family helped to make the homeward voyage pleasant. On the morning of Mr. Emerson's 70th birthday, his friend met him on deck and put into his hands the following verses. End note. To R. W. Emerson, blessed of the highest gods are they who die ere youth is fled. For them their mother fate, clasping from happy earth to happier sky, frees life and joy and love from dread of date. But thee, revered of men, the gods have blessed with fruitful years, and yet for thee, in sooth, they have reserved for all their gifts the best, and thou, though full of days, shalt die in youth. Charles E. Norton, May 25, 1873. Editor's note. Mr. Emerson landed in Boston, May 27th. Before sailing, his home in Concord had been burned, and now from the steamer he looked on his native city, which since his departure had been devastated by fire even to his birthplace, which was where the great establishment of C. F. Hovey and Company now stands. That was in the autumn, and now the statelier building was rapidly advancing. When he and his daughter got out of the cars at Concord, to their astonishment they found a large part of the population assembled there to greet them. They welcomed the two returned travelers with a cheer, echoed from the passengers in the train as it moved on. Then, as the reunited family entered the carriages, the local band played, and escorted by the children of all the schools and many friends and neighbors, they drove home, passing under a welcoming triumph arch. There stood the house among the trees, except for its freshness, looking without and within as if nothing had ever happened. Mr. Emerson entered and saw, then turned rapidly, walked to the gate, and said such words of joy and gratitude as his emotion would allow. The smiling crowd dispersed, and he re-entered his home to realize its restoration and greet his nearer friends. End note. Egypt. Mrs. Helen Bell, it seems, was asked, "What do you think the Sphinx said to Mr. Emerson?" "Why," replied Mrs. Bell, "the Sphinx probably said to him, 'You're another.'" For the writers on religion, none should speak on this matter polemically. It is the gay science, and only to be chanted by troubadours. Professor Max Muller has dedicated his new book to me, and sent me a copy. I have read it, and though I am too dull a scholar to judge of the correctness of his courageous deductions from resembling names, or to relish this as I did his earlier books, I respect and thank his erudition and its results. Editor's note. Mr. Emerson was invited to make the address at the opening of the Concord Free Public Library in September, built and given to the town by one of its sons, William Monroe. The following paragraphs were written while he was preparing for this occasion. The address is printed in Miscellanies. End note. Be a little careful about your library. Do you foresee what you will do with it? Very little, to be sure. But the real question is, what it will do with you. You will come here and get books that will open your eyes and your ears and your curiosity and turn you inside out or outside in. You will find a book here that will tell you such news of what has been seen lately at the observatories in the sun and the other stars that you will not rest until you find a telescope to see the eclipse with your own eyes. 'Tis only the other day that they found out what the stars are made of, what chemical elements identical with those that are in our planet are found in Saturn, what in the sun, and that human life could not exist in the moon. They have just learned that Italy had people before the Romans, before the Etruscans, who made just such arrowheads as we find in Concord, and all their tools were stone. Mr. Marsh told me he picked them up in Africa as in Vermont, and they find these all over the world, and the world, instead of being 6,000 years old, has had men on it 100,000 years. All the new facts of science are not only interesting for themselves, but their best value is the rare effect on the mind, the electric shock. Each new law of nature speaks to a related fact in our thought, for every law of chemistry has some analogon in the soul, and however skilful the chemist may be, and how much soever he may push and multiply his researches, he is a superficial trifler in the presence of the student, who sees the strict analogy of the experiment to the laws of thought and of morals. We read a line, a word that lifts us. We rise into a succession of thoughts that is better than the book. The old saying of Montluc that one man is worth 100 and 100 are not worth one is quite as true of books. Our reading sometimes seems guided. I open a book which happens to be near me, a book I had not thought of before, and seeing the name of a known writer, I sit down to read the chapter, which presently fixes my attention as if it were an important message directly sent to me. Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859, but Stallo in 1849 writes, "Animals are but fetal forms of man." Stallo quotes Liebig as saying, "The secret of all those who make discoveries is that they regard nothing as impossible." The lines of our ancestry run into all the phenomena of the material world. Stallo. Theologic Mysteries. Our theology ignores the identity of the worshipper. He has fallen in another, he rises in another. Can identity be claimed for a being whose life is so often vicarious or belonging to an age or generation? Harvard College. My new term as overseer begun at the close of Commencement Day, 1873, and ends at the close of Commencement Day, 1879. Life. Quote, "We do not take into account what life is in the concrete, the agreeable habit of working and doing, as Goethe names it, the steadily engaging, incessant instreaming of sensations into the bodily comfortableness." End quote. Hegel in Varnhagen. Editor's note. The latter half of the year was quietly passed in Concord by Mr. Emerson, except for a visit to his daughter, Mrs. Forbes, and her husband at Noschen. As the English publisher with whom he had dealings, and as it were an enforced arrangement about a new volume, only suspended by his illness, had died, that matter was not troubling him. On December 16th, the centennial anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, Mr. Emerson completed his poem Boston, so long meditated, and, by request, read it at the celebration in Faneuil Hall. End note. This is the end of Journal Collection number 64, dating from the year 1873, when the author was 70 years old. Thank you for listening.